The iron collar around Grashka's neck had been removed at dawn, but the bruises from its weight would remain for weeks, dark purple against her green skin like storm clouds on summer grass. She stood at the edge of the cliff where her clan had left her, watching the sun climb higher over the endless forest below, her bare feet already bleeding from the sharp stones of the mountain pass. Her body clad only in the thin shift they had allowed her to keep as a final mockery of mercy. The elders had spoken their judgment in voices hard as winter ice, declaring that any orc who would heal a human child, even one lost and dying in the woods, had forsaken the old ways and deserved nothing but exile and whatever death the wilderness chose to grant. Grashka had not wept when they stripped her of her weapons, her tools, her warm furs, because she knew the value of what she had done, knew it in the marrow of her bones where the child's grateful mother had pressed a kiss to her knuckles before fleeing back to her own people, and no amount of suffering could make her regret choosing compassion over tradition. The descent from the mountains took most of the day, her legs shaking with exhaustion and hunger by the time the steep rocks gave way to gentler hills covered in pine and birch. Her throat burned with thirst, her tongue thick in her mouth, and the thin shift that had seemed adequate in the morning now felt like nothing at all as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. She had been trained as a warrior, as all orcs were, but survival skills assumed you had at least a knife, a flint, some scrap of resource to build upon, and she had been given nothing, absolutely nothing, sent into the world as naked of possessions as a newborn babe, but without the promise of a mother's care. The forest seemed to mock her with its abundance that she could not reach squirrels chittering in branches too high to climb without rope, birds nesting in places her weakened body could not access, even the stream she finally found running too fast and cold to catch the fish she could see flashing silver in its depths. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Grashka had stumbled out of the forest into a landscape she had never seen before, open and cultivated, with fields of grain stretching golden toward distant farmhouses. She knew she should hide, should keep to the woods where at least there were places to shelter, because humans in these borderlands would not welcome an orc, especially not one who looked as desperate and dangerous as she must appear. But her body had reached the end of its resources, her vision swimming with dark spots, her knees buckling as she tried to keep walking. And when she finally collapsed at the edge of a wheat field, she could only be grateful that the earth was soft with recent tilling, that at least she would not die on the cruel stones of the mountain. She did not lose consciousness entirely, but drifted in a strange twilight state where the sky above seemed to pulse and breathe, where the sound of footsteps approaching might have been real or might have been the drumbeat of her own failing heart. When a shadow fell across her face, blocking out the dying light of the sun, she tried to focus her eyes on the figure standing above her, tried to summon enough strength to defend herself or flee, but her limbs would not obey, would not do anything but lie there trembling in the dirt. "Holy saints and stars," a man's voice said, rough with shock but not with hatred, and then there were hands on her shoulders, strong and calloused, turning her gently onto her back. "What happened to you?" Grashka managed to open her eyes fully, blinking against the glare of the sunset behind the man's head, and saw a human face looking down at her with an expression she had not expected: concern. Genuine worry creasing the skin around eyes the color of summer rain. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and a jaw shadowed with a few days of stubble, wearing the simple homespun clothes of a farmer, all earth tones and practical fabric. She tried to speak, to explain or perhaps to warn him away, but her throat produced only a croak, dry and broken. The man she would later learn his name was Owen. Northwood did not hesitate the way she had expected a human to hesitate when confronted with an orc. Instead, he slipped one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her with a grunt of effort that acknowledged her solid, muscular build but did not struggle with it, and began carrying her across the field toward a small farmhouse visible in the distance. Grashka wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that helping her would only bring him trouble, but the warmth of another living body against her skin, the security of being held instead of abandoned, overwhelmed her intentions, and she found herself going limp in his arms, her head lolling against his chest where she could hear the steady thump of his heartbeat. The farmhouse was small but well-maintained, with a thatched roof recently repaired and walls of whitewashed plaster between dark wooden beams. Owen kicked the door open with his boot and carried her inside, laying her carefully on a bed near the fireplace, which he immediately set about stoking into crackling life. The interior was simple, one large room that served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom, with a loft overhead that probably held storage. Everything clean and organized in the way of a person who lived alone and took pride in his space. Grashka's eyes tracked his movements as he worked, watching him fill a cup with water from a pitcher, watching him gather blankets from a chest, watching him approach her again with that same expression of concern. "Can you drink?" he asked, kneeling beside the bed and slipping a hand behind her head to lift it slightly. "Slowly now, not too fast or you will be sick." The water was the most beautiful thing Grashka had ever tasted, cool and sweet, and she had to fight her body's instinct to gulp it down, forcing herself to take the small sips Owen allowed. When the cup was empty, he refilled it and let her drink again, and then a third time before he seemed satisfied, setting the pitcher within her reach on a small table beside the bed. He draped the blankets over her shivering form, tucking them around her shoulders with a gentleness that made something in her chest ache with confusion and gratitude. "I am going to make some broth," Owen said, moving toward the fireplace where a pot already hung on an iron hook. "Something light that will not upset your stomach. When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning," Grashka managed to rasp out, her voice still rough but functional now that water had eased her throat. Before they cast me out." Owen's hands paused in their work of adding water and dried herbs to the pot, and he glanced back at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Your people did this, left you with nothing." "I healed a human child," Grashka said, the words coming easier now, though they still carried the weight of everything she had lost. "Broke the old laws. They said I was no longer one of them." She waited for his expression to change, for the kindness to drain away and be replaced with suspicion or disgust, because why would a human care about the internal politics of orcs? Why would he see her as anything but a monster regardless of her reasons? But Owen only nodded slowly, stirring the pot as the water began to heat, adding what looked like dried vegetables and a small piece of salt pork. "I have heard the clans can be harsh about such things," he said quietly. "The old ways do not leave much room for mercy." "You do not seem surprised to find an orc in your field," Grashka observed, her mind beginning to clear as warmth and water brought her body back from the edge of collapse. "Most humans would have left me there, or worse." Owen was silent for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on the broth, but Grashka could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked as he chose his words. "I was a soldier once," he said finally. "Fought in the border wars 10 years ago, saw things that, well, I saw enough to know that cruelty is not unique to any one people. And I saw enough good men die for stupid reasons that I decided, when I finally got my discharge, that I would not add to the suffering in this world if I could help it. He ladled some of the broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to her, helping her sit up enough to drink without spilling. It was simple fare, just hot water and herbs and a hint of meat, but to Grashka's starved body it was a feast, warmth spreading through her belly and into her limbs. Owen watched her drink, his rain-colored eyes careful and assessing, and she had the sense that he was seeing more than just her physical state, was measuring something deeper. "You can stay here tonight," he said when she had finished the bowl. "Longer, if you need time to recover. I will not turn you out." "Why?" Grashka asked, the question bursting from her before she could consider whether it was wise. "You do not know me. I could be dangerous." A smile flickered across Owen's face, brief but genuine. "You can barely sit up without help." "I think I can handle the danger for now. And as for why—" he shrugged, turning back to bank the fire for the night. "Maybe I remember what it feels like to need help and not have anywhere to turn. Maybe I am just tired of seeing people suffer when I have the means to prevent it." "Does the reason matter so much?" Grashka did not know how to answer that, so she remained silent, sinking back into the pillows as exhaustion pulled at her consciousness. The bed was soft, softer than the furs she had slept on in the clan's communal longhouse, and the blankets smelled like lavender and sunshine. She tried to stay awake, tried to remain vigilant in case this kindness was some sort of trick or trap, but her body had other priorities, and within moments, she was falling into the deepest sleep she had known in days, perhaps in months. She woke several times during the night, disoriented and afraid, her warrior's instincts screaming that she was in an unknown place and vulnerable. Each time, she would tense and prepare to fight or flee, only to see Owen sleeping peacefully in a chair near the fire, wrapped in a cloak, having given her his bed without hesitation. The sight of him there, keeping watch without being asked, gradually eased the panic, and eventually she managed to sleep through until dawn without waking. Morning light filtered through the small windows, golden and gentle, and Grashka opened her eyes to find Owen already up and moving quietly around the room, adding wood to the fire and setting a kettle to boil. He noticed her watching and offered a nod of greeting. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. "Better," Grashka admitted, pushing herself up to sitting and discovering that her body, while still weak and sore, was no longer quite so desperately empty. "The water and food helped." "I imagined so, given how close you were to—" Owen cut himself off, shaking his head. "Well, you are here now, and that is what matters. I have porridge cooking if you can stomach it." They ate in companionable silence, Grashka still processing the strangeness of sitting at a table with a human who seemed to have no fear of her, no disgust at her green skin and tusks. Owen ate with the efficient focus of a man used to working hard, needing fuel rather than pleasure from his food, though he made sure her bowl was filled generously before serving himself. When they finished, he cleared the dishes and then turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "I need to work the fields today," he said. "Harvest is coming soon and there is much to do. You are welcome to rest here or to walk around the farm if you feel strong enough. It would be better if you stayed close to the house. My nearest neighbor is half a mile away, but sometimes people cut through this way, and I would rather not have to explain anything yet." Grashka understood what he was not saying, that his willingness to help her would not be shared by others, that her presence here put him at risk of social censure or worse. "I will stay inside," she promised. "And Owen, thank you for everything." His face softened at the sound of his name from her lips, and he nodded once before heading out the door, leaving her alone in the quiet farmhouse. Grashka spent the morning resting and slowly exploring the space, noting the details that spoke of Owen's life, the bookshelf with a small collection of well-worn volumes, the weapons hanging on the wall that confirmed his story of being a soldier, the careful repairs and maintenance evident in every corner. There were no signs of a woman's presence, no delicate items or decorative touches, just the practical comfort of a man who lived alone and was content with it. By afternoon, she felt strong enough to venture to the doorway, leaning against the frame and watching Owen work in the distant field, his shirt discarded in the heat, his back and shoulders showing the lean muscle of someone who labored with his body every day. There was something almost meditative about the way he moved, a rhythm to the swing of his scythe that spoke of years of practice, and Grashka found herself oddly mesmerized by it, by this human who had shown her more kindness in a single evening than her own clan had offered in the final months before her exile. The days began to develop a pattern. Owen would rise early and work the fields, coming back at midday for a simple meal that Grashka gradually began to help prepare, using the cooking skills she had learned in her clan, but adapting them to human ingredients and tastes. He never asked her to work, never demanded anything in return for his hospitality, but she could not bear to simply rest while he labored, and so she began finding small ways to contribute, mending a tear in his spare shirt with careful stitches, organizing the storage in the loft, tending the small vegetable garden near the house that had been somewhat neglected in the press of larger tasks. Owen noticed, of course, but he said nothing directly, simply accepting her help with quiet nods of appreciation. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and sometimes he would read aloud from his book stories of distant lands and ancient heroes that Grashka had never encountered in the oral traditions of her people. She loved those evenings, loved the sound of his voice rapping around the words, loved the way his face would animate when he reached an exciting passage, loved the feeling of being part of something peaceful and domestic. It was during one of those evenings, perhaps 2 weeks after her arrival, that Owen finally asked the question she had been dreading. They were sitting at the table after dinner, the remains of their meal cleared away, and he had been uncharacteristically quiet, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface in a nervous rhythm. "Grashka," he said slowly, "what are your plans?" "I do not ask because I want you to leave," he added quickly, seeing her tense. "You are welcome to stay as long as you wish, but I wonder if you have thought about what comes next, about what you want from your life now." Grashka stared down at her hands, at the green skin that marked her as other, as exile, as someone who belonged nowhere. "I have no plans," she admitted. "I cannot return to my clan, and I cannot simply walk into a human settlement and expect to be welcomed. I suppose I will need to find somewhere remote, somewhere I can live alone without disturbing anyone." "That sounds like a desperately lonely existence," Owen said quietly. "Perhaps," Grashka agreed, "but it is the only option I have." "It is not," Owen said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up, made her meet his eyes across the table. "You could stay here. Permanently, I mean. This farm is more than one person can properly manage, and you have already proven yourself capable and hardworking. I could. We could work it together." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Grashka was almost afraid to examine. "The neighbors would talk," she said carefully. "They would not understand." "Let them talk," Owen said, a hint of defiance entering his tone. "I have never cared much for the opinions of people who judge without knowing, and you have as much right to build a life as anyone." "You would risk your standing in the community for me?" Grashka asked, disbelief coloring her words. "You barely know me." Owen leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know that you saved a human child at great cost to yourself. I know that you work hard and ask for nothing. I know that you make this house feel less empty than it has in years. That seems like enough to know." Something warm and dangerous unfurled in Grashka's chest, something that felt like hope or perhaps the beginning of something deeper. "Then I will stay," she said softly. "If you are certain." "I am certain," Owen replied, and the smile he gave her was bright enough to rival the fire. The decision made, they settled into their new arrangement with surprising ease. Grashka took on more of the farm work, her orcish strength making tasks like hauling water and splitting wood far simpler than they had been for Owen alone. He taught her the rhythms of agriculture, the way to read the sky for coming weather, the proper time to plant and harvest each crop. She taught him some of the orcish techniques for preserving food and tracking game, skills that proved useful as autumn deepened, and they began preparing for winter. The first time a neighbor saw Grashka, it went about as well as could be expected, which is to say, poorly. A man named Thomas had come to ask Owen's help with a broken wagon wheel and had stumbled upon Grashka carrying firewood behind the house. His shout of alarm brought Owen running, and it took nearly an hour of careful explanation to prevent Thomas from riding off to fetch others with weapons. Even then, the man left with dark mutterings about unnatural alliances and the corruption of good men, and Owen had been quiet and tense for the rest of the day. "I am sorry," Grashka said that evening, watching him stare into the fire with troubled eyes. "I have brought you nothing but difficulty." "No," Owen said firmly, turning to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You have brought me companionship and help and happiness, if I am honest. Thomas is an old fool who sees threats everywhere. His opinion means nothing to me." But over the following weeks, it became clear that Thomas had spread word of what he had seen, because the casual visits from other farmers stopped entirely. And when Owen went to the village to trade for supplies, he returned with a tight set to his jaw and a report of cold shoulders and suspicious glares. Grashka watched him bear this ostracism with stoic grace, never once suggesting that she should leave, never treating her with anything but respect and kindness. And her feelings for him deepened into something that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the loft where she now slept, listening to him breathe in the bed below. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with bitter winds and heavy snows that transformed the farm into a world of white silence. They were snowed in for days at a time, forced into close quarters, and Grashka discovered that she did not mind, that in fact she treasured these times when it was just the two of them, the outside world rendered irrelevant by the storm. They would sit by the fire and talk for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Owen told her about his time in the war, about the friends he had lost and the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the dark hours before dawn. Grashka told him about her mother, who had died when she was young, about her training as a warrior, about the strange loneliness she had always felt among her clan, as if some part of her never quite fit the mold she was supposed to fill. "Perhaps that is why you were able to help the human child," Owen mused one evening, his voice thoughtful. "Because you already understood what it meant to be different, to not quite belong." "Perhaps," Grashka agreed, drawing her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. "Though I did not think of it that way at the time, I just saw someone who needed help and I could not walk away." "That is who you are," Owen said softly. "Someone who helps, even when it costs you everything." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the way the firelight played across his features, saw the warmth in his eyes that had nothing to do with the flames, and felt her heart begin to pound with a realization she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with him, had perhaps already fallen, and the knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But she said nothing, because what could she say? That she, an orc woman with nothing to her name, had developed feelings for the human man who had saved her life. That she dreamed of a future that seemed impossible, where they could be more than just farmer and helper, more than just two lonely souls sharing a house. It seemed like a cruelty to burden him with such knowledge, so she kept it locked inside, a secret treasure she took out only in the privacy of her own thoughts. The winter deepened, and with it came a new threat. Wolves, driven down from the mountains by hunger and cold, began prowling around the farm at night, their howls echoing across the frozen fields. Owen reinforced the chicken coop and the small barn where he kept his plow horse and 2 cows, but the predators were persistent, and one night they managed to break through, killing 3 chickens before Owen's shotgun blasts drove them off. "We need to hunt them," he said the next morning, examining the damage with grim determination. "They will keep coming back until they have taken everything or we stop them." Grashka, who had been raised among a warrior people, agreed immediately. "I can track them," she offered. "And I know how to fight, even without proper weapons." Owen regarded her seriously, then nodded. "I have some spare weapons from my soldier days. We can see what fits you best." He brought out a collection of blades and bows, and Grashka found herself gravitating toward a simple but well-made spear, its weight and balance familiar to her trained hands. Owen took his rifle and a hunting knife, and together they set out into the snowy forest, following the tracks the wolves had left during their retreat. Tracking in snow was easier than in summer, the prints clear and obvious, and within a few hours they had located the pack's den, a rocky outcropping with a sheltered hollow beneath. There were 5 wolves, all large and desperate-looking, their ribs showing through their fur. Owen raised his rifle, sighting on the alpha male, but Grashka put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Wait," she said quietly. "They are only trying to survive, just like us. If we kill 1 or 2, the others will leave this territory. We do not need to slaughter them all." Owen lowered the rifle slightly, considering. "You are right," he said after a moment. "We are not in the war anymore. We only need to protect what is ours." They made noise, shouting and banging Owen's knife against a rock, and when the wolves emerged, snarling and ready to defend their den, Owen fired a single shot into the ground near the alpha's feet. The explosion of snow and the crack of the rifle were enough to send the message. And after a tense moment where the wolves seemed to consider attacking anyway, the pack turned and fled deeper into the forest, leaving their territory behind. Walking back to the farm, Grashka felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with violence avoided, and everything to do with the partnership she and Owen had demonstrated, the way they had worked together, trusted each other's judgment, acted as a team. She glanced at him, walking beside her with his rifle slung over his shoulder, and found him already looking at her, a soft smile on his face. "We make a good team," he said, echoing her thoughts. "We do," Grashka agreed, her heart full. That night, as they sat by the fire warming themselves after the cold trek, Owen reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. It was the first time he had touched her with clear intent, the first time the barrier of casual contact had been crossed into something more, and Grashka felt her breath stop in her throat. "Grashka," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something, and I do not know if it is wise, but I cannot keep it inside any longer." "What is it?" she asked, though she thought she might already know, might already see it in the way he looked at her. "I care for you," Owen said, his rain-colored eyes intense and sincere. "More than I should, perhaps, more than is wise given everything that makes this complicated. But I care for you, and I think I think I am falling in love with you, and I needed you to know, even if you do not feel the same." Joy burst through Grashka like sunrise, bright and overwhelming, and she tightened her grip on his hand, leaning forward until their faces were close, until she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I have felt the same for weeks, but was afraid to say it, afraid that I was presuming too much." Owen's smile was radiant, transforming his usually serious face into something boyish and delighted. "Then we are both fools," he said, and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both still not quite believing this was real. But then Grashka sighed against his mouth and Owen pulled her closer, deepening the kiss into something that spoke of weeks of longing and restraint finally released. Her tusks made the angle slightly awkward, but they adjusted, finding a way that worked, that felt natural and right, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads resting together. "I do not know how we make this work," Owen said quietly. "The world is not kind to people like us, who love across the lines they have drawn." "Then we will forge our own way," Grashka replied with the certainty of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. "Together." The rest of the winter passed in a haze of quiet happiness, their relationship deepening as the snow piled higher, and the outside world became increasingly remote. They learned each other's bodies with tender exploration, discovering what gave pleasure and what made the other laugh, finding joy in the simple intimacy of sharing a bed and waking up together. Grashka had never felt so cherished, so seen, and she poured all the fierce loyalty of her warrior's heart into loving Owen, into making their small farmhouse a haven against the cold and the prejudice that waited beyond their walls. Spring came eventually, as it always does, the snow melting into rushing streams and the first green shoots appearing in the thawed earth. They worked together to prepare the fields for planting, Grashka's strength invaluable for the heavy labor of plowing and hauling. The work was hard but satisfying, each day bringing visible progress, the farm slowly coming back to life after its winter sleep. It was in late spring, when the fields were planted and the first tender shoots were pushing through the soil, that trouble arrived in the form of a delegation from the village. 5 men on horseback, led by Thomas, rode up to the farmhouse with grim expressions and weapons visible on their belts. Owen, who had been working in the garden, straightened at their approach, his face going carefully neutral. Grashka, who had been inside preparing the midday meal, came to the doorway, her hand instinctively moving to the spear that now leaned against the wall within easy reach. "Owen Northwood," Thomas called out, not dismounting, "we need to talk about your situation here." "I am not sure what situation you mean," Owen replied calmly, though Grashka could see the tension in his shoulders. "I am simply working my farm as I have every right to do." "You are harboring an orc," another man said, his voice sharp with disgust. "Living with it from what we hear. It is unnatural, Northwood. It is wrong." "She," Owen corrected, steel entering his tone, "is a person named Grashka, and she has done nothing wrong. She works this farm with me, and what we do here is our own business." "It becomes our business when it threatens the community," Thomas said. "What happens when more orcs come looking for her? What happens when they decide to raid our village because you have given them cause to think we are weak?" "My clan will not come," Grashka said, stepping out of the doorway to stand beside Owen, ignoring his sharp glance that clearly said he wanted her to stay inside. "They exiled me. I am dead to them. Your village is in no danger because of my presence." "The word of an orc means nothing," the first man spat. "You could be lying, could be planning anything." "She is not lying," Owen said, his voice hard now, the soldier showing through the farmer's calm exterior. "And I will not have her insulted on my own property. If you have a legitimate concern, state it plainly. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them, and Grashka felt her warrior's instincts come alive, sensing danger in the way hands drifted toward weapons, in the set of shoulders preparing for action. She shifted her weight, ready to move, ready to fight if necessary, though she desperately hoped it would not come to that. "The village council has discussed this," Thomas said finally. "We are prepared to offer you a choice, Northwood. Send the orc away and you can continue to trade with us to be part of the community. Keep it here and you will be cut off entirely. No trade, no help if you need it, nothing. You will be alone." Owen's jaw clenched, and for a long moment he was silent, his rain-colored eyes distant as he thought. Grashka felt her heart begin to break because she understood what they were asking him to sacrifice, understood that choosing her meant choosing isolation and hardship, and she could not bear to be the cause of his suffering. "Owen," she said softly, touching his arm, "it is all right, I can go. I can find somewhere else." "No," Owen said, the words sharp and final. He turned to look at her, and the fierce determination in his eyes stole her breath. "No, you are not going anywhere." He faced the men on their horses, his stance wide and solid, unmovable as a mountain. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "you can take your ultimatum and ride back to the village with it. Grashka stays. She is my partner in this farm and in my life, and I will not turn her out to satisfy your small-minded prejudice. If that means I am cut off from your community, so be it. I managed alone before, and I will manage alone again, though I will not truly be alone because I will have someone worth far more than all of your approval combined." The men looked stunned, clearly not having expected such a flat rejection of their offer. Thomas's face flushed red with anger. "You are making a mistake, Northwood, a mistake you will regret." "The only mistake I ever made," Owen replied, "was caring what people like you thought. Now get off my land." For a moment, it seemed like the men might argue further, might even resort to violence, but something in Owen's stance, in the cold promise of his soldiers' eyes, convinced them otherwise. They wheeled their horses and rode away, kicking up dust, and Owen stood watching them until they were out of sight, his body still tense and ready. When they were finally gone, Grashka turned to him, tears streaming down her face, though whether from fear or gratitude or love she could not say. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice breaking. "You have lost everything because of me." Owen turned to her, his face softening, and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "I have lost nothing that matters," he said into her hair. "And I have gained everything that does. Do you understand, Grashka? You are my home now, not the village, not their approval. You—" She clung to him, her strong arms wrapped around his back, and let herself cry, let herself release all the fear and tension of the confrontation. Owen held her through it, stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances, and gradually the tears subsided, leaving behind a strange sense of peace, of rightness, as if something had been settled that had long been uncertain. They went back to work, because the farm did not care about human politics, and the crops needed tending regardless of social consequences. But the confrontation had made something clear, had forced them to acknowledge the reality of their situation. They were together now, truly together, and the world could accept it or not as it chose. As summer progressed, they discovered that being cut off from the village was less dire than Thomas had probably hoped. Owen had always been fairly self-sufficient, and with Grashka's help, they were able to produce most of what they needed. what they could not make themselves, Owen obtained through a traveling merchant who cared more about coin than politics, and was happy to trade with them despite the village's boycott. The farm flourished under their combined efforts, the harvest that year being the best Owen had seen in years. They worked from dawn to dusk, side by side, and in the evenings they would sit together and plan for the future, talking about improvements they could make, animals they might acquire, the possibility of expanding the fields. It was during one of these evening conversations, as the summer heat began to give way to the first cool breath of autumn, that Owen went quiet for a long moment, his fingers playing with the edge of his cup. "Grashka," he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I want to ask you something, but I do not know if it is even possible given everything." "What is it?" she asked, setting aside the sock she had been mending. Owen took a deep breath, then met her eyes with an expression so vulnerable it made her chest ache. "I want to marry you. I know that the village priest would never perform the ceremony, and I do not know if your people even have such traditions, but I want you to be my wife in truth, not just in practice. I want to stand before whatever gods or spirits will listen and pledge myself to you forever. Would you? Could you want that too?" Grashka felt her eyes begin to burn again with tears, but these were tears of pure joy, of disbelief that she could be this fortunate. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Owen, I want that more than anything." He grinned, looking both relieved and delighted, and pulled a small object from his pocket, a ring, simple and made of iron, clearly crafted by his own hands in the forge he kept for repairing tools. "I made this," he said, taking her hand and sliding the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. "It is not gold or silver, but it is perfect," Grashka interrupted, staring at the ring through her tears. "It is from you, and that makes it worth more than any precious metal." They married themselves a week later, on the autumn equinox, standing in the field where Owen had first found her and speaking vows they had written together. There was no priest, no witnesses except the sky and the earth and the crops growing golden around them, but it felt more sacred than any ceremony in a church could have been. Owen promised to honor and cherish her, to stand beside her against whatever the world might throw at them, to love her until his last breath. Grashka promised to be his partner and his strength, to build a life with him that honored both their peoples, to love him with all the fierce loyalty of her warrior's heart. When they kissed to seal their vows, the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the farm, and Grashka felt a sense of completeness she had never known before, a feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. The year turned, winter came and went, and their life together settled into a rhythm that felt eternal, as if it had always been this way and always would be. They faced hardships, a bad storm that damaged the barn roof, a bout of illness that left Owen weak for weeks, the ongoing isolation from the broader community, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. It was in the second spring of their marriage that Grashka discovered she was pregnant. She had not been entirely sure it was even possible, given the differences between their peoples. But the signs were unmistakable: the morning sickness, the fatigue, the subtle changes in her body that she recognized from helping with births in her clan. She told Owen one evening as they sat by the fire, watching his face transform from shock to wonder to fierce joy. "A child," he breathed, reaching out to place his hand gently on her stomach, though it was far too early to feel any movement. "Our child. Are you happy?" Grashka asked, suddenly uncertain because they had never discussed this possibility, had never planned for it. "Happy," Owen laughed, the sound bright and incredulous. "I am terrified and thrilled and so full of love I feel like I might burst. "Yes, Grashka, I am happy. Are you?" "I am," she said, covering his hand with hers. "I did not know I wanted this until the moment I knew it was real, but now I cannot imagine anything I want more." The pregnancy progressed normally, or at least as normally as anyone could judge given the unprecedented nature of it. Grashka remained strong and healthy, her orcish constitution serving her well, and Owen hovered like an anxious mother hen, constantly trying to convince her to rest more and work less. She tolerated his fussing with patient amusement, understanding that it came from love and fear, from the knowledge that he could not bear to lose her or the child she carried. In late autumn, as the leaves turned gold and red and the harvest was gathered in, Grashka went into labor. It was long and difficult, her body struggling with the process in ways that made Owen pale with fear, but she was strong, had always been strong. And when the sun rose the next morning, she held a squalling infant in her arms, a daughter with green-tinged skin lighter than her mother's, with tiny tusks just visible in her gums, with Owen's rain-colored eyes. Owen wept openly when he first held her, this tiny perfect blend of both their peoples, this proof that love could create new life even when the world said it should not be possible. They named her Alara, which meant light in the old human tongue, because she was the light of their lives, the hope of their future. Raising a child on the frontier farm was challenging but filled with joy. Alara grew quickly, showing the hybrid vigor of her mixed heritage, strong and healthy and curious about everything. She toddled after her parents as they worked, learning the rhythms of the farm, growing up knowing nothing but love and acceptance from the two people who mattered most. When Alara was 2 years old, something unexpected happened. A young woman appeared at their door, travel-worn and frightened, with a black eye and bruises on her arms. Her name was Beatrice Blackwell, and she was fleeing an abusive husband, having heard rumors somehow, despite the isolation of a place where an orc and a human lived together in defiance of normal rules, a place that might offer sanctuary to someone else who did not fit. Owen and Grashka took her in without hesitation, giving her the loft to sleep in and asking no questions beyond what she was willing to share. Beatrice proved to be a hard worker and a gentle soul, and she bonded quickly with young Alara, helping to care for her while Grashka and Owen worked. She stayed through the winter, slowly healing from her physical and emotional wounds, and in the spring, she announced her intention to build a small cottage on the far edge of their property, to stay permanently if they would allow it. "We seem to be collecting strays," Owen joked that evening, though his eyes were warm with affection as he watched Beatrice playing with Alara by the fire. "Good," Grashka said firmly. "Let the village keep its narrow minds and closed doors. We will build something better here, something that welcomes those who need welcome." And so they did. Over the following years, others came, people fleeing bad situations, people who did not fit in the rigid structures of village society, people who had heard whispers of the strange household, where an orc woman and a human man had built a life together. Not many, never a huge number, but enough that the farm began to feel like a small community of its own, a place where difference was celebrated rather than condemned. They built more cottages, established a proper smithy, planted orchards, and expanded the fields. Owen taught the newcomers his agricultural techniques, and Grashka taught them orcish methods of hunting and tracking. Beatrice, who had a gift for healing herbs, established a garden of medicinal plants and began serving as the settlement's healer. Alara grew up surrounded by this eclectic family, learning that love came in many forms, that strength was found in diversity, that kindness mattered more than tradition. The village eventually noticed what was happening, of course. How could they not, when the small homestead had transformed into a thriving settlement. There were mutterings, complaints to distant authorities, even a half-hearted attempt to run them off that was rebuffed by the unified front of all the residents working together. But ultimately, the village could not deny the success of what Owen and Grashka had built, could not ignore the fact that their settlement produced surplus crops that the traveling merchants bought eagerly, could not overlook the fact that people were choosing to live there rather than in the traditional village. Attitudes began to shift, slowly, grudgingly. A farmer whose crops had failed came asking for help and was given aid without question. A child from the village, sick with a fever that the village healer could not cure, was brought to Beatrice and returned home healthy, and the mother never forgot the kindness. Small bridges were built, one careful interaction at a time, until the day came when the village sent a delegation not to condemn, but to ask about establishing trade relations. Owen, now graying at the temples and weathered by years of hard work, but still strong and vital, met with them in the main house, Grashka standing at his side as she always did. They negotiated fair terms, established regular trading schedules, even discussed the possibility of the settlement sending a representative to the regional council. It was not a complete reconciliation, not a wholesale admission that the village had been wrong, but it was progress, and Owen and Grashka accepted it as such. On the evening after the delegation left, having signed agreements that would benefit both communities, Owen and Grashka walked together through the settlement they had built, greeting neighbors, checking on the various projects in progress, ending up at the field where they had married themselves so many years ago. The wheat was tall and golden, ready for harvest, swaying gently in the warm breeze. "You ever regret it?" Owen asked quietly, taking her hand as they stood looking out over the field. "Staying with me, choosing this life. You could have found somewhere to live in peace, somewhere you did not have to fight so hard to simply exist." Grashka turned to look at him, at this man who had found her dying and chosen compassion, who had loved her when the world said such love was impossible, who had built a life and a family and a community with her through sheer stubborn determination. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life with you is more than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me a home, Owen, not just a place to live, but a true home, and I will never regret that." He smiled, that soft smile that still made her heart flutter even after all these years, and pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "You gave me the same," he murmured. "I was just existing before you, just going through the motions. You made me remember how to live." They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Two people who had defied the world's expectations, and two people who had chosen love over fear and built something beautiful from that choice. Around them, their settlement hummed with life, the sound of children playing, of people calling to each other, of a community built on acceptance and mutual support. Ilara, now a young woman herself and courting a young man from the village who did not care about her mixed heritage, came to find them as the stars began to appear. "Papa, Mama," she called, using the terms that blended both their languages. "Are you coming to the gathering? Everyone is waiting." Owen and Grashka exchanged a glance, then followed their daughter back toward the central fire where the community gathered each evening to share a meal and stories. This was their life now, full and rich, and surrounded by people they loved and who loved them in return. The journey from that sunrise when Grashka had been cast out with nothing to this moment had been long and hard, but every step had been worth it. As they settled into their places around the fire, Owen's hand finding Grashka's as naturally as breathing, she looked around at the faces illuminated by the dancing flames, humans and half-orcs, people of all backgrounds and stories, united by the simple fact that they had all found welcome here when the world had turned them away. This was their legacy, the thing they had built together, and it would endure long after they were gone. The future stretched out before them, uncertain as all futures are, but Grashka faced it without fear. Whatever came, they would face it together, and that had always been enough. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of seasons, each bringing its own challenges and joys. Owen and Grashka aged gracefully, their hair turning silver but their love remaining as strong as ever. They watched Alara marry and have children of her own, watched the settlement grow and prosper, watched as the world around them slowly, painfully, began to learn the lesson they had embodied from the beginning, that love and acceptance were stronger than hate and fear. On a quiet spring morning, when Grashka was well into her 60s and Owen approaching 70, they walked together to the field where he had first found her, where they had married themselves, where so much of their life together had been rooted. The wheat was just beginning to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing up through the dark soil, and the air was fresh with the promise of renewal. "We did well, didn't we?" Owen said, his voice still strong despite his years. "Built something worth building." "We did," Grashka agreed, leaning against his shoulder, her head fitting into that familiar spot beneath his chin. "Better than I ever imagined possible. No regrets, not a single one." They stood there in comfortable silence, two souls who had found each other against all odds and refused to let the world's prejudices define their love. The settlement behind them was waking up, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys, voices calling out morning greetings, the sounds of a community beginning its day. Children who would never know a world where such a place did not exist, where an orc and a human loving each other was unthinkable, where difference was met with violence rather than curiosity. Grashka thought back to that terrible sunrise when she had stood on the mountain, stripped of everything, believing her life was over. She thought about the journey down, the desperate stumbling, the moment of collapse in the wheat field. She thought about opening her eyes to see a human face looking down at her with concern instead of hatred, about the decision that had been made in that instant to help rather than harm. Everything had flowed from that moment, from Owen's choice to be kind when kindness was not required, from his choice to see her as a person rather than a monster. And she had chosen to stay, to trust, to open her heart to the possibility of love. And those choices had created a life more rich and full than anything her clan could have offered. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words encompassing everything: the rescue, the acceptance, the love, the life they had built together. Owen turned to look at her, his rain-colored eyes still bright with love despite the years. "For what?" "For seeing me," Grashka said simply. "For choosing compassion. For loving me when the world said you should not." "It was the easiest choice I ever made," Owen replied and kissed her, soft and sweet, a kiss that tasted of spring and hope and forever. They walked back to the settlement hand in hand, ready to face another day of the life they had created, a life built on love and acceptance, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a home, deserved kindness, deserved a chance to build something beautiful. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across the fields, and Grashka smiled, her heart full, her spirit at peace. She had been banished at sunrise with nothing, and a frontier farmer had found her by dusk. That was how their story had begun. But the ending, the true ending, was this: two people who loved each other deeply, surrounded by a community they had built together, looking forward to whatever time they had left with gratitude and joy. It was more than a happy ending. It was a triumph.